Okay, so for my demo, I am doing the grammar translation method. I'm teaching the target language of English to a French-speaking middle school classroom. The setting I had in mind was a classroom of 20 students. That's the setting that I would be probably most familiar with. Um, the linguistic focus of the lesson is location vocabulary, weather vocabulary, and prepositional phrases, which relies on some prior knowledge of nouns and noun phrases and things like that, but the lesson for today is going to be prepositional phrases. The primary objectives are that the students come away from the lesson with is the ability to translate, to make inferences based on comprehension of reading materials, and to create compositions using vocabulary and prepositional phrases that we go over. So it's primarily focused on the reading and the writing aspect of it. There really isn't anything in this lesson about speech. And I also have some more objectives throughout the lesson that we'll go over. But to start off, my students would read a few sentences. So students, I would ask, read the sample sentence. The sample sentence we would read together is John and Sally rented a boat and went for a sail around the lake. Translate the following English words into French. So these are the English words they should know from their vocabulary, and I would want them to translate. Next, I would want them to answer the following questions based on their understanding of the sample sentence, and they would be able to reference the sentence, John and Sally rented a boat and went for a sail around the lake. The questions, 1, does John spend time outdoors? This would require that they understand all of the English words in this sentence, specifically what it means to spend time outdoors, and the fact that they would need to know that a lake is a location that is outdoors. So the correct answer to that would be yes. 2, is Sally afraid of the water? Well, they would have to know what the word water means. They would have to know what the word afraid means. So I guess this would rely on some prior knowledge of emotion words as well. So John and Sally rented a boat and went for a sail around the lake. The lake is water, if they know that location word. So the correct answer would be no, Sally is not afraid. 3, is it likely that the weather was stormy on this day? So this would require some knowledge of weather words, and making an inference that if it was stormy, if it was rainy, if the weather was bad, they would not be going out on the lake on a boat. So John and Sally rented a boat and went for a sail around the lake. They would need to know the weather was not stormy in all likelihood. So the correct answer would be no. Then I would want to focus on some vocabulary review. So here are some weather words and some location words. When I learned French, these are some words that we learned the other way, basically. So I would want them to work together or by themselves to come up with the French equivalent of these English words. So they would need to know these words and be able to translate them back. I would want to review that as a class and just kind of do a call and response. So class, what does sunny mean? They would have to answer. Ensoleillé, we would go over cloudy, stormy, rainy, mountain, ocean, lake, city, farm, and there is an English and a French translation. So they would need to know how to translate back and forth. It's one of the focuses of this lesson is an emphasis on translating and finding the equivalence between both languages. So if they know all of these words, then we will have accomplished at least one of the objectives for this lesson. Next, we would move on to the actual grammar, which is, I think, the meat of the lesson. I think a lot of the vocabulary memorization the students would be responsible for on the first day that it was introduced, and then as homework assignments, and then for the rest of the time using those words, and as we progress through the class, they would be expected to keep those words in mind and have that knowledge. So then we would move into prepositional phrases, which I would give them a definition for. The definition I have is a group of words that gives more information and modifies about which one, how, when, why, who, or where. Like I said, my target students would be a classroom setting of middle school age kids. So if you've taken grammar at a collegiate level, then you know that there are a lot more things that prepositions do, but this would be the focus for grade school age. So the form of a prepositional phrase is a preposition plus a noun or pronoun, which is called the object. So this requires some prior knowledge of a noun, a person, place, or thing, what a preposition is, and what kind of words that is, on, about, over, before, all of those kinds of words, and then being able to use nouns or pronouns. So then we have some examples of English prepositional phrases, starting with the preposition, an article, and then the noun, which is a vocabulary word that the students should be familiar with. So some of the examples I have are 1, on a boat, 2, around the lake, which you might recognize from the sample sentence, 3, to the mountain, 4, in a city, 5, beside the ocean. And I would ask the students to translate all of these into French with a partner or as a class, and we could do kind of a call and response sort of thing. All of these words are pretty simple. These are from their vocabulary, and the preposition, or the lesson is about prepositions, so these are the words that they would be learning and be expected to know. So then I would want to apply the grammar form and have them practice with that. So they would be expected to fill in the blank with a preposition and an object to describe the where of the person, my little stick man, and the shape, which is whatever shape will be below there. That would also be some vocabulary that we would work on learning. So the example is, this person is above the square. So we can tell based on my drawing that there is a stick person that is on top of, above. There are a few different prepositions that they can use. I would expect some variation in responses, but at the end of the day, there are correct and there are incorrect answers to this exercise as well. And then we would all work together to learn the words for the shapes that the little stick person is on top of. So this person is above the square. I would ask the students in French or English, or both really, if they had any questions about the lesson, if they had any questions about the example and what they were expected to do for their assignment, and then we could work on it as a class. So this would focus on them recognizing the patterns in the preposition. So I put a note that they shouldn't reuse the same preposition. So number 1, you can see the person is below the triangle. That's the form that I would expect. So below the triangle. And if we have consensus on that or any questions, I'd be able to answer that. Number 2, the person is above, on top of the circle. So I put a little star next to these two because I wanted the students to try using complex prepositions, so they don't have to just use above, below, beside, on top of is also a preposition that they could use even though it's not one word. So I figured they could use on top of, or they could just use on. So for this one, we'll just do on the circle. Keep it simple for this one. And then I wanted them to really try using a complex preposition for the third one, so that's why I put it down here. So there are a few different ways you could go with this. Beside is definitely one, but I hope that they use a complex preposition for this one. So in my mind, the correct answer, like I said, I'm sure there's some variation, but in front of the rectangle. I'm not expecting all of the students to know at this stage all of the shapes, but it would be something that we could start to introduce in this lesson. But the important focus is on the preposition. So this would be an introduction to maybe the next set of vocabulary, some terms that aren't necessarily as related to real world, but that they do still need to know to have a grasp on the vocabulary of the language. And then we could go over another list of prepositions. I know there are tons of prepositions, and knowing a list of vocabulary is important, but I think, at least for the grammar translation method, yes, they do have to know how to translate, but it's also very important to recognize the grammatical structure. So below the triangle, they need to understand that a prepositional phrase is always going to look like this. It's never going to look like anything else. There's always going to be an object, there's always going to be a preposition at the front, some sort of determiner or article in the middle probably, yeah. And then I would want them to translate the previous prepositions they chose into French. So like I said, there could be some variation, but I'm expecting just the typical response to be below, on, and in front of. So they would fill in whichever English translation, or I'm sorry, whichever English preposition or complex prepositions they used, and then I would expect them to translate each of these into French, the native language, from the target language to the native language. So then I would assign them some homework. I would expect that they would write a story, a composition, using at least 6 prepositional phrases and then translate into English. So I would let them know that that's what is expected on them. So the focus is on reading and writing. And I would also want them to use 4 vocabulary words from the location unit. Not only are they using the grammatical structure, but also the vocabulary and translating back and forth between the target and their native language. And part 2 of the homework would be to read. So they don't actually have to do any work or questions or anything like this until next class. I wouldn't expect them to take a quiz at home or do a write-up or some sort of report or anything like that. I would more than likely do a quiz at the beginning of the next class, but they would need to read chapter 1 of a children's book. So the one I picked was Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. It's very important that they are able to translate back and forth, recognize the grammatical functions of the target language, especially so as better to recognize the grammatical functions of their native language and do that mental exercise. And it's also important that they can read literature in English. So that concludes the lesson using the grammar translation method.